Imagine the scene. It's Christmas Day, the year 800. We are in the heart of Rome, inside the old St. Peter's Basilica. The air is thick with the smell of incense and beeswax candles. Light streams through high windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny golden spirits. A huge crowd has gathered, their hushed whispers echoing off the ancient stone walls. They are here to witness something truly special. At the center of it all is a towering figure, a man of immense presence and power. This is Charles, King of the Franks, a warrior king known across Europe. We know him better today as Charlemagne. He is a giant of a man for his time, with a commanding gaze and a reputation forged in decades of brutal, relentless warfare. Charlemagne had carved out a vast kingdom, stretching from modern-day France and Germany into Italy and beyond. He was a devout Christian, a patron of learning, and a fierce defender of the church. On this chilly Christmas morning, he knelt in prayer before the high altar, a humble servant of God in the eternal city. But Pope Leo III had a surprise in store for him, a moment of political theater that would change the course of European history forever. As Charlemagne rose from his prayers, the Pope stepped forward, holding a magnificent golden crown. In one swift, dramatic movement, Leo placed the crown upon the Frankish king's head, and the basilica erupted with a thunderous roar from the assembled nobles and citizens. To Charles Augustus, crowned by God, the great and peace-giving emperor of the Romans, life and victory. This was the cry that echoed through the church, a proclamation that sent shockwaves across the continent. In that single moment, something new was born. It was the revival of an idea that had haunted the European imagination for centuries, the Roman Empire. This wasn't the empire of Caesar or Augustus, a Mediterranean power based in Rome itself. This was a new, Christian empire, a Holy Roman Empire, with its heartland beating in the forests and river valleys of Central Europe. Charlemagne, the Germanic warrior, was now the successor to the Caesars, tasked with defending Christendom and ruling over a vast, diverse collection of peoples under the watchful eye of God. The coronation was a masterstroke of political genius, a powerful symbol that linked the raw military might of the Germanic tribes with the ancient prestige of Rome and the spiritual authority of the Catholic Church. It declared to the world, and especially to the other great empire in the East, Byzantium, that the West was no longer a chaotic backwater. It had a leader, an emperor, a protector. For Charlemagne, it was the pinnacle of his life's work. He had united a continent through conquest, and now he had the ultimate seal of approval. But this grand beginning also planted the seeds of 1,000 years of conflict, a continuous struggle over who held ultimate power, the man with the crown or the man who gave it to him. So what was this Holy Roman Empire? If you're picturing a country like modern France or Spain, with clear borders, a single government, and a unified people, you'll need to think again. The empire was something far stranger, far more complex. It was less a single state and more of a giant, sprawling jigsaw puzzle made of hundreds of different pieces, all of varying shapes and sizes. These pieces were kingdoms, duchies, counties, free imperial cities, prince-bishoprics, and tiny lordships, each with its own ruler, its own laws, and its own traditions. It was a patchwork quilt of territories covering most of what we now call Germany, Austria, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Belgium, and parts of Italy, France, and the Czech Republic. The man at the top, the emperor, was meant to be the glue that held this incredible mosaic together. But he wasn't an absolute monarch like a pharaoh or a Chinese emperor. His power was limited, and he had to constantly negotiate with the powerful princes and dukes who ruled the larger territories within the empire. These rulers, known as the prince-electors, had the crucial right to elect the next emperor. This meant that the imperial crown wasn't always passed down from father to son. It was a political game, a contest of influence, bribery, and alliances. The emperor had to work through a system of assemblies called imperial diets to pass laws or raise taxes, a slow and often frustrating process where everyone had a say. This decentralized structure was both a weakness and a strength. On one hand, it made the empire incredibly difficult to govern effectively. The emperor could rarely command the full resources of his realm in the way a king of England could. If he wanted to go to war, he had to persuade the princes to lend him their armies. If he needed money, he had to ask them to contribute. This often led to internal squabbles and a frustrating inability to act decisively on the European stage. The different states within the empire often had competing interests and would sometimes even go to war with one another, turning the heart of Europe into a battleground for local rivalries. On the other hand, this loose federation allowed for a remarkable degree of cultural and economic diversity to flourish. Cities like Nuremberg, Augsburg, and Cologne became bustling centers of trade, art, and innovation, enjoying a great deal of autonomy as free imperial cities that answered only to the emperor. Different regions developed their own unique dialects, customs, and legal systems. This system prevented any single ruler from imposing a rigid, centralized tyranny over Central Europe. It was a messy, complicated, and often chaotic arrangement, but it endured for a millennium, precisely because it was flexible enough to accommodate the ambitions and identities of hundreds of different little states. One of the great dramas that defined the Holy Roman Empire for centuries was the epic power struggle between the emperor and the pope. In theory, they were meant to be partners, two halves of the same Christian world order. The pope was the spiritual leader of Christendom. The emperor was the temporal leader, the sword of the church. It was a beautiful idea, God's authority flowing through two channels. But in practice, this beautiful idea led to centuries of bitter conflict. The flashpoint was the investiture controversy. Who had the right to appoint powerful church officials like bishops and abbots? These weren't just holy men, they were major landowners and princes who controlled vast wealth and armies. The emperors believed it was their right to choose these men. But reforming popes, most famously Pope Gregory VII, declared that only the church could appoint its own officials. This disagreement exploded into crisis in the 11th century. The story of Emperor Henry IV is the perfect example. When Pope Gregory insisted on his authority, Henry declared the Pope deposed. Gregory's response was swift and devastating. He excommunicated the emperor. This was a spiritual nuclear bomb. It released all of Henry's subjects from their oaths of loyalty. Suddenly, his powerful dukes had the perfect excuse to rebel. Facing total collapse of his power, Henry was forced into desperate penance. In the freezing winter of 1077, he journeyed across the Alps to the castle of Canossa. For 3 days, the emperor stood barefoot in the snow, begging the pope for forgiveness. Eventually, the pope lifted the excommunication, but the image of the mighty emperor humbled before the pope sent a clear message across Europe. Although the struggle would continue for generations, a crucial shift had occurred. The dream of a unified empire was slowly fading. The conflict fundamentally weakened the emperor's authority, allowing princes and dukes to gain more independence. It was a long, messy divorce that redefined the political landscape of the Middle Ages. Away from the grand struggles of popes and emperors, what was life actually like for the millions of people living within the Holy Roman Empire? For much of its history, it was a world defined by the land. The vast majority of the population were peasants, their lives dictated by the changing seasons and the demands of their local lord. They lived in small, tightly knit villages, working the fields from sunrise to sunset in a cycle of planting and harvesting that had changed little for centuries. Their world was small, often limited to the distance they could walk in a day. The local church was the center of their spiritual lives, while the local castle, looming on a nearby hill, was the symbol of power and authority. This was the age of feudalism, a system built on oaths of loyalty and service. At the top of this local pyramid was the lord, a duke, a count, a knight, or a bishop, who controlled the land. In return for being allowed to live and farm on the land, the peasants owed him a share of their crops, days of labor, and absolute obedience. Above the local lords were the great magnates, the mighty dukes of Saxony, Bavaria, and Swabia, who ruled vast territories almost as independent kings. They in turn owed allegiance to the emperor, promising to support him with their armies in times of war. This created a complex web of loyalties, a hierarchy of power that was often more theory than reality. The landscape of the empire was dotted with thousands of castles. These weren't the fairy tale palaces we imagine today. They were cold, damp, and formidable military fortresses. They were the power bases of the nobility, designed for defense and control. From these stone strongholds, knights would ride out, clad in chainmail and later in shining plate armor, to enforce their lord's will, defend their territory, or join the emperor's campaigns in Italy or the Holy Land. Cities, however, offered a different way of life. Places like Lübeck, Hamburg, and Cologne were growing into vibrant hubs of commerce, protected by thick walls and governed by their own wealthy merchant councils. Here, a different kind of power was emerging, one based not on land, but on money. Life was also profoundly shaped by faith. The rhythms of the day were marked by the ringing of church bells calling people to prayer. The calendar was filled with saints' days and religious festivals. People believed in a world infused with the divine, where miracles were possible and the devil was a real and present danger. Pilgrimages to holy shrines were common, and the great Gothic cathedrals that began to soar towards the heavens in cities like Cologne and Strasbourg were a testament to this deep collective faith. It was a world of stark contrasts, of deep piety and brutal violence, of grand castles and humble peasant huts, of local loyalties, and the overarching, often distant idea of a single Holy Roman Empire. For centuries, the one thing that had truly united the diverse peoples of the Holy Roman Empire was their shared Catholic faith. The Church was the common thread weaving through every aspect of life, from the lowliest peasant to the emperor himself. But in the early 16th century, a storm erupted from within the empire that would tear this unity apart forever. The storm was the Protestant Reformation, and it was unleashed by a stubborn, brilliant, and deeply troubled German monk named Martin Luther. He wasn't trying to destroy the Church. At first, he was only trying to reform it. He was outraged by practices like the selling of indulgences, certificates that promised to reduce time in purgatory for a price. In 1517, Luther famously nailed his 95 Theses, a list of arguments against indulgences and other church practices, to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg, Saxony. This was a university town, and this was the equivalent of posting a controversial topic for academic debate. But thanks to a revolutionary new technology, the printing press, his ideas didn't stay in Wittenberg. They were copied, translated, and spread across the empire like wildfire. His message resonated with millions. He argued that salvation came through faith alone, not good works or church rituals, and that the Bible, not the Pope, was the ultimate source of religious authority. This was a direct challenge to the very foundations of the medieval church. The emperor at the time was the young, powerful, and devoutly Catholic Charles V. He saw Luther as a dangerous heretic who threatened not only the church, but the very stability of his empire. In 1521, he summoned Luther to the Imperial Diet in the city of Worms. Standing before the most powerful men in the empire, Luther was ordered to recant his writings. In a moment of incredible bravery, he refused, famously declaring, "Here I stand, I can do no other." For Charles V, this was an act of rebellion, but Luther had powerful protectors, most notably Frederick the Wise, the Elector of Saxony. He and other German princes saw the Reformation as an opportunity to seize church lands and wealth, and to assert their independence from the emperor and the pope. The empire was now dangerously split along religious lines. The north and east of Germany largely embraced Lutheranism, while the south and west, including Austria and Bavaria, remained staunchly Catholic. This wasn't just a theological debate, it exploded into violence. Peasant uprisings and wars between princes tore the empire apart. The conflict culminated in the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, a reluctant compromise that established a crucial principle, cuius regio, eius religio, meaning whose realm, his religion. This allowed the ruler of each state within the empire to decide whether their territory would be Catholic or Lutheran. It was a pragmatic solution, but it shattered the dream of a unified Christian empire and set the stage for an even more terrible conflict to come. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 was more of a long truce than a lasting peace. The religious tensions between Catholics and Protestants continued to simmer for decades, honestly, like a volcano just waiting to erupt. The final catastrophic explosion came in 1618 and plunged the Holy Roman Empire and much of Europe into one of the most brutal and destructive conflicts in its history, the 30 Years' War. It began as these things often do, with a bizarre and dramatic incident in Prague, the capital of the Kingdom of Bohemia. The fiercely Protestant nobles of Bohemia were furious with their Catholic Habsburg king, who was trying to roll back their religious freedoms. So they stormed Prague Castle, and in an act of defiance, threw two of the king's imperial governors out of a high window. Miraculously, the officials survived the 70-foot fall, landing in a pile of manure. Catholics claimed they were saved by angels. Protestants joked they were saved by the filth. This defenestration of Prague was the spark that ignited the powder keg. What started as a local religious revolt in Bohemia quickly spiraled into a continent-spanning political war. It became a horrifying free-for-all, dragging in almost every major power in Europe. The Habsburg Emperor fought to re-establish Catholic dominance and imperial authority. The Protestant princes of Germany fought for their survival and independence. Soon, foreign powers intervened, seeing a chance to weaken the Habsburgs. Denmark, Sweden, and eventually Catholic France joined the fray, each for their own political reasons. The war was an absolute catastrophe for the people of the German lands. For 30 years, massive armies of mercenaries with no loyalty to anyone but their paymaster crisscrossed the empire. They plundered cities, burned villages, and massacred civilians with terrifying brutality. Famine and disease followed in their wake. The scale of the devastation is hard to comprehend. Some regions of the empire lost over half of their population. The city of Magdeburg was sacked in 1631, and of its 25,000 inhabitants, only 5,000 survived. It was an apocalypse that left deep scars on the German psyche for centuries. The war became a grim cycle of sieges, battles, and atrocities, fueled by religious hatred and political ambition. Finally, after 3 decades of unimaginable suffering, the exhausted combatants came to the negotiating table. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 brought the war to an end. This treaty was a landmark moment in European history. It reaffirmed the principles of the Peace of Augsburg, but also extended recognition to Calvinism, another major Protestant faith. More importantly, it completely shattered the emperor's remaining power. The hundreds of states within the empire were granted almost total sovereignty. They could now make their own alliances and foreign policy, as long as it wasn't against the emperor. The Holy Roman Empire was now, in effect, a hollow shell, a loose confederation of independent states with a figurehead emperor. The dream of a unified Catholic empire was dead and buried in the rubble of the war. After the devastation of the 30 Years' War, the Holy Roman Empire entered a long, slow period of decline. The Peace of Westphalia had fundamentally changed its nature. The imperial title, once the most prestigious in Christendom, now held little real power. The emperor, who was almost always a member of the Austrian Habsburg dynasty, reigned but did not truly rule. His authority was largely confined to his own hereditary lands in Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary. The rest of the empire had fractured into a constellation of over 300 independent states, each jealously guarding its own rights and privileges. The famous double-headed eagle, the symbol of the empire, now looked in 2 directions but had lost its sharp talons. Within this fragmented landscape, new powers began to rise, challenging the traditional dominance of the Habsburgs. The most formidable of these was the Kingdom of Prussia, centered in Brandenburg in the north. Under a series of ambitious and ruthless rulers, particularly Frederick the Great in the 18th century, Prussia transformed itself from a second-rate state into a first-rate European military power. Frederick built a disciplined, professional army that was the envy of Europe. He repeatedly clashed with the Habsburg Empress Maria Theresa in a series of wars over territory, most famously the rich province of Silesia. This Austro-Prussian rivalry became the dominant political dynamic within the empire, a German dualism that further paralyzed its already weak institutions. While the political structure of the empire stagnated, the 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment, brought a dazzling cultural and intellectual flowering to the German-speaking world. This was the era of the great composers, Bach, Mozart, and Haydn, whose music filled the courts of princes and the churches of the great cities. It was the age of philosophers like Immanuel Kant, who revolutionized Western thought, and writers like Goethe and Schiller, who forged a new German literature. This cultural blossoming, however, happened in spite of the empire's political structure, not because of it. The real energy was found not in the imperial court in Vienna, but in the smaller courts in university towns like Weimar, Leipzig, and Berlin. By the late 1700s, many intellectuals and political thinkers viewed the empire with contempt. The French philosopher Voltaire famously quipped that the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. To many it seemed like a ridiculous relic of the Middle Ages, an absurd collection of tiny states with bizarre customs and outdated laws. It was a museum piece, unable to defend itself, unable to reform itself, and unable to inspire the loyalty of its people, who increasingly identified themselves as Bavarians, Prussians, or Saxons, rather than as subjects of the empire. It was a grand, ancient, and hollowed-out structure, waiting for a strong wind to finally blow it over. The strong wind that would finally topple the ancient structure of the Holy Roman Empire blew from the west, from revolutionary France. The French Revolution of 1789 had sent shockwaves across Europe, and in its wake came a military and political genius of unparalleled ambition, Napoleon Bonaparte. As he rose to power, first as consul and then as emperor of the French, Napoleon sought to completely reshape the map of Europe. He saw the Holy Roman Empire for what it was, a weak, divided, and archaic entity ripe for dismantling. For him, it was an obstacle to his grand design for a French-dominated continent, and he set about taking it apart with ruthless efficiency. The Napoleonic Wars were the final, fatal blow to the empire. In a series of brilliant military campaigns, Napoleon's armies swept across Germany, inflicting one humiliating defeat after another on the Austrian and Prussian forces. At the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, known as the Battle of the Three Emperors, Napoleon crushed a combined Russo-Austrian army led by Emperor Francis II and Tsar Alexander I. This victory gave him mastery over Central Europe. He began to reorganize the German states to suit his own purposes. He rewarded his German allies like Bavaria and Württemberg by elevating them to the status of kingdoms, and he absorbed smaller territories into these larger states. In 1806, Napoleon created the Confederation of the Rhine, a new entity made up of 16 German states. Crucially, these states formally seceded from the Holy Roman Empire and allied themselves with France, accepting Napoleon as their protector. This was the final act of disintegration. The empire had now lost most of its western and southern territories. Its ancient institutions were meaningless. The emperor, Francis II of the House of Habsburg-Lorraine, was faced with a stark reality. His imperial title was now an empty fiction. To continue claiming to be the Holy Roman Emperor would be a farce. He was about to be humiliated by Napoleon, who might even try to claim the ancient title for himself. Faced with this grim situation, Francis II made a difficult but necessary decision. On the 6th of August, 1806, he issued a formal proclamation from his palace in Vienna. He declared the imperial crown and the government of the empire dissolved, releasing all states and officials from their oaths and obligations. And just like that, with the stroke of a pen, a political institution that had lasted for over 1,000 years, since the coronation of Charlemagne on Christmas Day in 800, ceased to exist. There was no great battle, no final siege of a capital city. The Holy Roman Empire did not go out with a bang, but with a quiet, solemn, and rather sad whimper. Its time had passed. A new age was dawning in Europe. So, the Holy Roman Empire is gone, a ghost of history. Why should we, in the 21st century, still care about this strange, complicated, and long-dead entity? We should care because its legacy is all around us, deeply embedded in the DNA of modern Europe. You can see it on a map. The decentralized, federal nature of modern Germany, with its powerful states like Bavaria and Saxony, is a direct echo of the old empire's patchwork structure. The existence of small, independent nations like Liechtenstein and Luxembourg is a remnant of the tiny principalities that once dotted the imperial landscape. The very idea of a Europe made of distinct but interconnected nations owes something to the empire's long history. The empire's 1,000-year story also offers us powerful lessons about power, identity, and conflict. The constant struggle between the universal claims of the emperor and the pope, and the local loyalties of princes and cities, is a drama that continues to play out in different forms today. Think of the modern tensions between national governments and supranational organizations like the European Union. The devastating religious wars that tore the empire apart serve as a chilling reminder of the dangers of intolerance and the catastrophic consequences of mixing religious dogma with political power. The eventual acceptance of religious diversity in the Peace of Westphalia laid the groundwork for our modern ideas of state sovereignty and religious freedom. Furthermore, the cultural achievements that flourished within the empire's loose framework are a vital part of our shared world heritage. The soaring Gothic cathedrals, the revolutionary ideas of the Reformation, the birth of the printing press, the philosophical leaps of the Enlightenment, and the sublime music of Bach and Mozart, all of this emerged from the unique environment of the Holy Roman Empire. Its many courts and free cities acted as incubators for art, science, and thought, creating a rich and diverse cultural tapestry that still enriches our lives. It was a world that, despite its political fragmentation, was intellectually and culturally connected. Ultimately, the story of the Holy Roman Empire is the story of an idea, the dream of a unified, peaceful Christian Europe. It was an idea that was never fully realized, an ambition that constantly fell short. It was often chaotic, violent, and messy. But for 1,000 years it provided a framework, however fragile, for a vast swathe of Central Europe. It shaped the continent's languages, laws, religion, and political boundaries. To understand the Holy Roman Empire is to understand the deep roots of modern Germany, Austria, and their neighbors. It's a reminder that the world we live in today was not inevitable. It was forged in the crucible of history, in the successes and failures of grand, 1,000-year experiments like this one.